You're not working. You're not checking off things. You're not moving in an ordered, organized fashion to be able to get there. There are congregations of the Lord's people that do the same, right? Sometimes we say they keep house. They meet every Sunday, but there's no long-term plans. There's no long-term goals. There's no way of evaluating how are we doing, how are we not doing. There's none of that. This congregation, Philip went down, he taught them, they assumed responsibility. They began to get involved into work. They continued to have the support, no doubt, of Peter and John, of Philip and others, but it was theirs to carry on the work. And Philip helped them, and the Holy Ghost, of course, through these gifts, helped them to become self-sufficient very quickly. That's the goal that we have for congregations as well. The angel of the Lord calls Philip to arise and to go. God never wants us to sit still for very long. He wants us to be active. We may stay in one area for some time, but He doesn't want us sitting in that area. He wants us active in that area, even if we're there. He wants us on the go. Think about how many times this little word arise and this little word go appear in the Scriptures. They're many times connected with conversion. You remember that Saul of Tarsus was told, "Now why tarriest thou? Arise." Conversion is all about getting up and doing something. Following conversion, Christianity is all about getting up and doing something. It's all about being active. Think about the early church. Think about everything that we've read about them from Acts chapter 2 to this point. And how would you describe them? Wouldn't you not describe them as active? They went everywhere, the Bible says, preaching the Word. Now there was a moment at the beginning where they were settled there in Jerusalem and they were enjoying one another's fellowship. And no doubt the thinking was, we could go on doing this forever. It took persecution to get them moving. It took persecution to spread them out. God wanted them to be on the move. God wanted them to be active. He wants us to do the same. He went toward the south unto the way that goeth down from Jerusalem unto Gaza, which is desert. Most commentators suggest this is the old route. There was a new route that had been built, but likely he was going the old route. It was a Roman road. It was an ancient road. It was a road that led through deserted country. We see desert, and sometimes that causes a stumbling block because someone says, how is Philip going to baptize him in the desert? There's no water in the desert. And so how is there going to be enough water to immerse him? It must have been merely sprinkling or pouring, and sometimes people even suggest that he opened up a canteen and poured some water over him, and that was baptism. That does not fit the description of the text, nor does it fit the definition that the Bible gives us for baptism. Baptism's a burial, Romans 6:3-4. There had to be enough water to do that. So it's not talking about a desert in the sense that we sometimes think of a desert with cactuses and a whole lot of sand and nothing else, but it was a desert in the sense that there was no one living out there. He's leaving a city. He's leaving Samaria, a big city full of people who need to be converted and who evidently wanted to be converted. They were excited about what Philip was preaching. So he's leaving a large congregation of people, a large mission field to go into the desert. That seems extremely odd. But God knows what He's doing. And God told him to go. And so he went. But there's something that should come across to us in this, and that is that one soul is extremely important to God. One soul is extremely important to God. This man's soul was extremely important to God. This man was interested. This man wanted to know truth, and if he knew truth, he would obey truth. And God saw to it that he got the gospel. But think about this too, and God often sees things that we don't see. Through this one man that is converted, the gospel is going to go to another big place. It's in Samaria. It's already there. There are Christians there who can preach and teach and carry on the work. But the gospel evidently is not in Egypt yet. It's not where the Ethiopian eunuch is from. And so by the conversion of this one man, now the gospel is going to be there. And so what seems rather strange, go out into the desert and teach one man rather than teaching all the people here, all the people that are interested here, that doesn't make a lot of sense to us, but it made a lot of sense to God because there was a bigger picture here that God saw that maybe man didn't see. We have to understand that there is a bigger picture many times in our lives than what we see. Someone has observed that big doors swing on small hinges. I think that's true. Ira Rice, a number of years ago, was on a plane and he heard two men talking. Two men were talking about their native country. And they were talking about how they traveled in going to their country. And Brother Rice overheard that. Brother Rice had been looking for an opportunity to go into that country, but he didn't know how he could get in. And he overheard this conversation of them talking, and in his mind went off the idea, I'll just follow them. They know the easiest route. They know the quickest route. And so he literally, in overhearing their conversation, learned how to get into that country and plant the gospel there. Big door swung on the small hinges of simply overhearing a conversation and seeing the opportunity that was present there. That's true here. Verse 27, he arose and went, and behold, a man of Ethiopia, a eunuch of great authority, under Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, who had the charge of all her treasure, and had come to Jerusalem for to worship. God said, go. He went. And when he went, he was obeying God. As strange as it seemed, he was doing what God told him to do. Notice it says, a man of Ethiopia. Ethiopia, most commentators suggest this is an area just south of Egypt. For the Romans and the Greeks, it was considered the outskirts of the world. It was considered as far as you could go in the world. This was the outskirts of civilization as far as they were concerned. It was probably some 200 miles from Jerusalem. Now, 200 miles for us may not seem that great of a distance. But if you think about the way they traveled, 200 miles might have been the outskirts of the earth. It's a long way. I knew of an older gentleman when I used to preach in Mississippi over in Tippah County who had never been outside of that county. When I knew him, he was 80. He had never been outside of that county. That was hard for me to imagine. If you know anything about Tippah County, there's not much there. So to say that you'd never been outside of Tippah County was basically to say you had never seen much of the world. We had two restaurants. We had a Subway in a gas station, and we had a restaurant called Burgers and Stuff. That was the extent of where we had to eat in that town. If you didn't eat at home, that's where you ate. There just weren't many choices there. And Burgers and Stuff was correctly named because you could get burgers and stuff. You could get a tomato sandwich if you wanted to. Or you could get a steak if you wanted to. They served everything because they had the corner on the market. There was nowhere else to go. Small town. In fact, he had not even traversed the whole county. He had never been any further than Tippah County Lake, if you know where that is. That was probably, as the crow flies, about 6 to 7 miles from where he lived. He had spent 80 years on this earth in about a 6 to 7 mile circle. Well, most people in that county left during the Great Depression. They left looking for work. They moved to the bigger cities. He didn't. He stayed there. And I've talked to him about it. He said, I couldn't see that they ever got ahead of me. He said they came back and they were about in the same shape I was, and I never went anywhere. Well, the interesting thing about that is, for him, the world was extremely small. But there was a bigger world out there. There's a bigger world out there than just Samaria. There is this world that exists just south of Egypt. There are a lot of people there too, and their souls are just as valuable. Their souls are just as important. They are in need of the gospel just as much as those in Samaria are. This man of Ethiopia was a eunuch of great authority. This probably means that the eunuch was the secretary of the treasury. From what we can gather, from what his obligations were, he was a man extremely high in government. He possessed great authority. The name Candace, Queen of the Ethiopians, most suggests that Candace is not a proper name. Or Candace, as some people say, it's not a proper name. It simply refers to the position that she held. And so this is like we might refer to Pharaoh. Or Caesar. That's the kind of name that we're dealing with here. Historians tell us that in this region, there would have been a king also. But the king was considered to be the offspring of the sun. Essentially, a god. And so he didn't get preoccupied with the responsibilities of ruling a kingdom. He gave those responsibilities to his wife, to the queen. So there was a king here. There was a king, no doubt, in this land that was adored and worshipped as such. And his wife, the queen, ran the business. And so this man worked for her. We're told that he had the charge of all of her treasure, which must have been extensive. In fact, as we read of this man coming back from Jerusalem, he's reading a scroll. That may not mean a lot to you. But in a day and age where the Scriptures had to be copied by hand, it was not easy to get a copy of a scroll. And if you did get a copy of it, you paid handsomely for it. And he had a scroll, evidently that he had purchased. He was a man of some means. We're learning a lot about him if we'll just examine the details here. We've learned so far that he's a eunuch. That's key to this story. Those that served the king, those that served the queen, those that guarded the harem, they were usually eunuchs. Didn't have to be concerned with the offspring and knowing it was the king's. You didn't have to be concerned with him having distractions. No, all that was removed. He was focused on the work of the kingdom. He was a eunuch. We've noticed that he had great authority. We've noticed that he served the queen specifically. We've noticed the country that he's from. We've noticed his job, the charge of all of her treasure. Now, what would that tell you about this man? If he was in charge of all of her treasure, how did she feel about him? She must have trusted him, right? She must have thought, my treasure is safe in his hands. He's honest. He's dependable. He's not going to pilfer from it. It's safe. That's going to transfer over to this man's obeying the gospel. This man has an honest heart. He has a good heart. When Philip asked him, understandest thou what thou readest? You know what he says? He answers honestly, right? How can I? Except some man should guide me. Sometimes people ask us questions and we're like, oh yeah, I understand. I get it. I know. When we really may not. We're too embarrassed to say, no, I don't understand. No, I don't know. But this man said, I don't know. I don't know who's being talked about here. I need somebody to show me. He's honest. He's humble. And had come to Jerusalem for to worship. Now this tells us that he evidently was a proselyte. Or at least a God-fearer. Maybe not a full proselyte, but one who was known as a God-fearer. One who had seen the Jews' religion. One who had come to believe in Jehovah God. And he did that so much that he had traveled the great distance from his country, about 200 miles, up to Jerusalem for the purpose of worshiping. Did he have other business there? Perhaps. Jerusalem was a key city. Perhaps the queen had business in Jerusalem. Perhaps that was a part of this trip. But in his mind, I'm going there to worship. That's why I want to go there. That's why that city is important to me, is because that's the place where those who believe in Jehovah God worship. Traveled a great distance to come to Jerusalem for to worship. And as a proselyte, as a God-fearer, as one of another nation, as a eunuch, there were a great number of restrictions that were placed on him. He could not enter in to the area of the temple complex where others could. We sometimes suggest he had to stand on the outside. But he was willing to stand on the outside, and he would travel a great distance to do so. And yet we have people today who live in the shadow of this building who won't make the effort to be here for Bible study or for worship. We have people that have the convenience of an air-conditioned automobile, and yet they won't make the effort to be present at the service. You ever thought about the fact that we're going to be in judgment with people like the eunuch? We're going to be in judgment with them. This man traveled 200 miles under the worst circumstances through the desert to stand on the outside. And we won't travel across town in a fancy automobile to sit on a padded pew to worship God. That's not going to be very good for us if we're not committed on the day of judgment. Came to Jerusalem for the purpose of worshiping. Why did you come today? What was your purpose in coming? Was your purpose in coming today to pacify your parents, to pacify your husband, pacify your wife, to keep from getting a visit this next week from the preacher or from the elders or from someone else? What was your purpose in coming today? Why are you here? Are you here today merely to soothe your conscience, or are you here today for the purpose of worshiping? That's why you've come. You're here to worship. Because if you come for that purpose, it's far easier to keep from letting anything distract you when you're focused in on what your purpose is. It says in verse 28, was returning and sitting in his chariot, read Isaiah the prophet. He was coming home. He was sitting, notice, his chariot. It may suggest there were other chariots. It may suggest that this chariot belonged to him, which further emphasizes the authority that he possessed. Most commentators, Wayne Jackson, for example, suggest that chariots in those days, from what we can gather, were manned by 2 or 3 other people. So likely the eunuch was not driving his own chariot. He was a man of authority. There was someone who was he had a driver. And perhaps he not only had a driver, but he may have had someone who was sitting by the driver with some type of a weapon. He's a man of great authority. He is on Queen's business. He is the guard of her treasure. Makes sense that there would have been others. Also think about the fact that as he was coming home, he was reading. Now sometimes I read when I drive. I try not to. I know it's not a smart thing to do. But sometimes we do. Sometimes we have an outline, we have a Bible, we have something. And when we stop at red lights or whatever, we're brushing up on something. Could he have been doing that? Well, he didn't have the benefit of an automobile with a steering wheel and some of the conveniences that we have. And so he was in a position of having to control horses or some type of beast if he was driving. Even if he wasn't driving, it would not have been easy to read. You ever try to read in an automobile, a back seat of an automobile? Not easy to do. But imagine trying to read in the back seat of a chariot on a cobblestone road. That's not easy to do. Now think about this man. This man's been to worship, and what is he doing on his way home from worship? Still reading, still studying. Maybe something had been said, he had heard, he was interested in it. Maybe that's why he purchased this scroll. Or maybe he just purchased this scroll and couldn't wait to dig into it. I'm that way when I buy a book. I can't wait to get into it. I bought a book. I'm interested in it. I can't wait to start it. Can't wait to see what it's about. Can't wait to see what I can learn. Maybe that was what his position was. But whatever, he's reading on the way home. It's not easy to read. He's got to deal with the wind. He's got to deal with the sun. He's got to deal with the bumps. He's got to deal with all the things that are a part of travel in those days. And yet he's reading. Now again, let's take some self-evaluation here. He didn't have a Bible like this. He didn't have thumb indexed. He didn't have leather cover. He didn't have things divided in book chapters and verses. He had a scroll. And to save space, because paper and other things were of a premium, they ran the words together. My words are divided. It's pretty easy to read. His wasn't easy to read. No, it all looked like one big long sentence from the top of the page to the bottom of the page. You had to try to distinguish where the words were. It wasn't easy. It wasn't easy. But under those circumstances, he was still giving the effort to read. Do you read your Bible every day? You got a far better situation than he did. You got a far better Bible than he had. You have far more comforts than he had. He's reading on his way home. You might read on your way home from church today, but if you do, it'll be because I said something and you don't think it's there. That's likely why you'd be reading on the way home, right? But he's reading. He's studying his Bible even as he's going home. Remember, this man's going to be in judgment with us, right? This man's going to be in the same judgment with us. Here I am with this fancy Bible, and I don't read and study it. Here he is with this old scroll where the words run together, wind blowing in his face, chariot bouncing him all around, but he's reading and I'm not. It's scary, isn't it, when we really think about people before and the sacrifices they made in comparison to what we do. He was reading Isaiah the prophet. This is Isaiah. It's interesting that he would be reading Isaiah. You may want to sometime go and read Isaiah 65. I believe it's Isaiah 65. It might be Isaiah 56. Let me quickly check that and make sure. It's a chapter that deals with eunuchs. And it is a chapter that, yes, it's Isaiah 56. And the reason why I say that is, a scroll likely would not have contained the entire book of Isaiah. It may very well have just been a portion of the book of Isaiah that it would have contained. We know what portion of the book he had, at least one part of it, because he was reading from Isaiah 53. And so we know at least he had Isaiah 53. What did he have something before that? Did he have something after that? Likely he had a section of Isaiah here. If he did, he may very well have had Isaiah 56 as a part of his section. Maybe why he was interested in this scroll. Listen to what it says beginning in verse 3. Neither let the son of the stranger that hath joined himself to the Lord speak, saying, the Lord hath utterly separated me from his people. Neither let the eunuch say, behold, I am a dry tree. Here is the man who has joined himself to the Lord. That's the eunuch. He is a proselyte. He's a God-fearer. He's joined himself to the Lord. He wasn't born in Israel. He wasn't born as a Jew. He's joined himself to them. Notice what he says. The Lord hath utterly separated from his people. Don't let him say that. Now, we've already talked about the fact that he traveled all that distance, but he couldn't even enter in. He had to stay on the outside. But God said, don't let him say that. Don't let him say he's separated. there was a wall of partition that divided Jew and Gentile in the first century. But Isaiah is talking about a time when that middle wall of partition is going to be broken down, where this man is not going to be separated any longer. Notice he says, let not the eunuch say he was a eunuch. Behold, I am a dry tree. A dry tree is a tree that isn't going to produce any fruit. The eunuch, he wasn't going to have any offspring. It wasn't possible for him to have any offspring. He wasn't going to have anyone to carry on his name. He might have felt like a dry tree. But God says, don't let him feel that way. Why? Because under the gospel system, he can have. Through his efforts, through his work. Paul had a son in the faith, right? He had someone he had converted and led to Christ. Notice verse 4. For thus saith the Lord unto the eunuchs that keep my Sabbaths. Here are eunuchs that are concerned with remembering and serving God. He's one of those. He chose the things that please me and take hold of my covenant. He had done that. Verse 5. Even unto them will I give in mine house and within my walls a place and a name better than of sons and daughters. You don't think that would have been interesting to this man? I'm going to have a place that's better than that place of sons and daughters. I'm going to be adopted by God. He says this, I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. He had a name that was going to die as soon as he died. No descendants, no one to carry on that name. But God says, I'm going to give him an everlasting name. I'm going to give him a name that will last forever. What is that name? It's the name Christian, Acts 11:26. He's going to get to wear that name. That's the hope that this man has. Verse 6. Also the sons of the strangers that join themselves to the Lord to serve Him and to love the name of the Lord, to be His servants, every one that keepeth the Sabbath from polluting it and taketh hold. He's going to talk about others to whom blessings are now extended. This man may very well had been looking for the hope, and he found it in this section of Isaiah. But he's reading in Isaiah 53, and that's the basis for all of this. That's the basis for what this man's going to enjoy. Because all of this was made possible by Jesus Christ and His sacrifice. And Peter's going to tell him about the man recorded in Isaiah 53. We'll have to stop there today. We'll pick up, Lord willing, next time.